He was already dying when he rose to his knees. Blood soaked through the canvas of his medic's pack, mixing with the black volcanic mud of Horseshoe Hill. Japanese machine gun fire carved the air above him into geometric patterns of death. Mortar fragments had torn through his abdomen, his legs, his chest. He had perhaps 30 seconds of consciousness remaining. And in those final moments, Private First Class Frank Joseph Petrarca did something no one who witnessed it would ever forget. He screamed, not in pain, not in fear, in defiance, in rage against the darkness closing around him. If you stay with me until the end of the story, you'll understand why that scream mattered. Why it changed everything. Why a carpenter from Cleveland became one of the most decorated medics in American history. And why his death on his 25th birthday would save thousands of lives he would never meet. Frank Joseph Petrarca was not supposed to be a hero. He was supposed to be building houses. In the spring of 1940, Cleveland, Ohio was a city still scarred by the Depression. The factories along the Cuyahoga River ran at half capacity. Men lined up outside union halls at dawn, hoping for day work that often never came. Frank was 22 years old, trained as a carpenter, and like most young men in his neighborhood, he understood that skill with your hands meant nothing if there was no work to be had. His father had come from Italy decades earlier with the promise that America was a place where hard work guaranteed survival. By 1940, that promise felt like a lie told to children. The Ohio National Guard offered something Cleveland could not. Steady pay, 3 meals, a uniform that carried a dignity unemployment could never provide. Frank enlisted not because war was coming, though everyone knew it was, but because his family needed money and the Guard paid on time. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall, wiry from years of physical labor, with dark hair and eyes that people later described as quiet. Not shy, quiet. There was a difference. Shyness suggested fear of the world. Quietness suggested a man who watched, who measured, who kept his own counsel. He trained on weekends, learning to march and shoot and salute. He was assigned to the 145th Infantry Regiment, a unit with roots stretching back to the Civil War, though most of the men in it had never seen combat. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the 145th was federalized within hours. Frank Petrarca, carpenter, became Frank Petrarca, soldier. Somewhere in the chaos of mobilization and training rotations, someone looked at his file and made a decision that would define the rest of his short life. He was reassigned as a combat medic. He had no medical training. None. The Army gave him a canvas bag with bandages, sulfa powder, and morphine syrettes. They gave him a Red Cross armband. They gave him a crash course in where to stick a needle and how to tie a tourniquet without killing a man from shock. Then they gave him a rifle company to keep alive and shipped him to the South Pacific. The Solomon Islands in 1943 were a vision of hell wrapped in tropical beauty. Dense jungle canopy filtered the sunlight into a perpetual green twilight. The heat was suffocating. Not the dry heat of a desert, but a wet, clinging heat that turned every breath into an act of will. Rain fell in torrents that turned foxholes into swimming pools and trails into rivers of mud. The ground itself was hostile. Black volcanic soil sucked at boots. Roots caught ankles. Everything rotted. Fabric, leather, skin. Men developed jungle rot on their feet, fungal infections in their groin, fever from a dozen different parasites. And everywhere, in every shadow, was the knowledge that someone was trying to kill you. The New Georgia campaign was part of the larger island-hopping strategy designed to push Japanese forces back toward their home islands. The target was Munda Point, where the Japanese had built an airfield that threatened Allied shipping lanes. The 37th Infantry Division, including Frank's 145th Regiment, landed on New Georgia in July 1943 with orders to take Munda and eliminate Japanese resistance. What they found was an enemy that had spent months fortifying the jungle into a fortress. The Japanese defense of New Georgia was unlike anything the Americans had encountered in previous campaigns. Pillboxes made of coconut logs and coral, invisible until you were 10 feet away. Spider holes where a single sniper could pin down an entire squad. Interlocking fields of fire from machine gun nests positioned on high ground. The Japanese had learned from their losses at Guadalcanal. They would not waste men in suicidal charges. They would bleed the Americans in the jungle, yard by yard, until either the Americans broke or reinforcements arrived. Horseshoe Hill was one of several ridgelines protecting the approaches to Munda. It was called Horseshoe because of its shape, a curved elevation that gave the defenders a perfect killing ground in the valley below. The 145th Infantry attacked Horseshoe Hill on July 27, 1943. Frank Petrarca moved forward with the second wave, staying low, watching the men ahead of him disappear into the tree line. The sound of combat in the jungle was disorienting. You couldn't see more than 20 or 30 yards in any direction. Rifle fire cracked from invisible sources. Machine guns stuttered in short, professional bursts. Mortars screamed down through the canopy, fragmenting before they hit the ground and sending white-hot shrapnel in every direction. Men started falling. Not dramatically, not like in the movies. They just stopped moving forward and crumpled into the undergrowth. Some screamed. Most didn't. The ones who screamed were the ones Frank had to reach. He learned within his first hour of combat that being a medic was not about medical skill. It was about movement, about making your body do things your brain screamed against. Every instinct, every survival mechanism honed over millions of years of evolution, demanded that you stay low, stay hidden, stay alive. Being a medic meant ignoring all of it. It meant standing up when everyone else was flat against the earth. It meant running toward the sound of screaming when everyone else was running away. The first man Frank treated on Horseshoe Hill had been hit in the thigh. Arterial bleed, bright red, pulsing. Frank's hands shook as he tore open the medic bag. He couldn't remember the training. His mind was blank except for the sound of machine gun fire and the smell of blood and the man's eyes looking up at him, pleading. He pressed gauze against the wound and tied it tight. Too tight. The man screamed. Frank loosened it. Blood flowed faster. He tightened it again, feeling the femoral pulse beneath his fingers, trying to find the balance between stopping the bleeding and stopping the circulation. The man passed out. Frank gave him morphine, marked an M on his forehead with iodine so the stretcher bearers would know, and moved on. By nightfall on July 27th, the 145th had gained perhaps 200 yards. The cost was 63 casualties. Frank had treated 14 of them. He had done everything wrong, and most of them had survived anyway because in combat medicine, speed mattered more than precision. A tourniquet applied in 30 seconds saved more lives than a perfect bandage applied in 5 minutes after the man had bled out. That night, in a foxhole filled with 3 inches of rainwater, Frank didn't sleep. He replayed every decision, every moment of hesitation, every mistake. His hands still shook. He wondered if they would ever stop. Around him in the darkness, other men whispered or wept or lay silent with their eyes open. The jungle at night was loud with insects and rain and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. You learned to identify the sounds. Friendly mortars made a hollow thump when they launched. Enemy mortars whistled. Tree bursts from artillery had a sharp crack. Direct hits had a deeper thud. Each sound meant something different, carried a different weight of probability about whether you would survive the next 10 seconds. July 29th began with a mortar barrage at dawn. The Japanese had registered their guns on the American positions during the night, and they opened up just as the light broke through the canopy. The first rounds landed long. The second salvo walked back toward the line. Men scrambled out of foxholes and sprinted for cover. Frank pressed himself against the base of a shattered tree and counted the impacts. 7, 8, 9. Then silence. Someone was calling for a medic. Frank's stomach tightened. The voice was coming from where the mortars had landed, which meant moving into an area the Japanese gunners had just proven they could hit with precision. It also meant someone was still alive, which meant there was no choice. He grabbed his bag and ran. The sergeant was buried up to his chest in dirt and shattered wood. A mortar had landed in his foxhole, collapsed it, and somehow failed to kill him. His face was gray with shock. He couldn't feel his legs. Frank started digging with his hands, clearing the debris, checking for bleeding, talking constantly, keeping the sergeant focused on something other than the fact that he might be paralyzed or that another mortar barrage could land at any second. Other men arrived and helped pull the sergeant free. His legs were intact. Bruised, possibly fractured, but intact. Frank splinted them, gave him morphine, and watched the stretcher-bearers carry him away. Only then did he notice the tremor in his own hands had stopped. His mind was clear. The panic that had defined his first day of combat was gone, replaced by something colder, more mechanical. He wasn't thinking about fear anymore. He was thinking about time and distance and angles of fire. This was how men changed in combat. Not all at once, but in increments, each crisis peeling away another layer of civilian thinking until what remained was a creature adapted to violence. Frank Petrarca the carpenter was dissolving. Frank Petrarca the medic was taking his place. The fighting on July 30th was sporadic. The 145th consolidated their positions, brought up ammunition and water, evacuated the wounded. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese were preparing a counterattack. Additional machine gun fire had been heard from the ridgeline. Forward observers spotted movement in the tree line. The men dug their foxholes deeper and waited. Frank turned 25 years old at midnight on July 31st, 1943. He didn't celebrate. Nobody knew. In the American Army of World War II, birthdays were noted in personnel files and forgotten everywhere else. There were no cakes in the jungle, no singing, no leave. You were born, you lived, you fought, and sometimes you died, and the date on which any of these things happened mattered only to the clerks who filed the paperwork afterward. The attack came at first light. Japanese infantry, supported by machine guns and grenade dischargers, hit the American positions from 3 directions simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming. Not loud the way a thunderstorm is loud, but dense, layered, a wall of noise that made thinking difficult and communication impossible. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear. Men fired at muzzle flashes and shadows. The jungle itself seemed to be attacking, every tree concealing an enemy, every movement a potential threat. Frank moved through the chaos like a man underwater. Everything was slow and thick and distorted. He treated a private with a sucking chest wound, sealing it with the cellophane wrapper from a cigarette pack and tape from his medic bag. He treated a lieutenant with shrapnel in his shoulder, digging out the larger fragments with forceps, packing the wound with sulfa powder. He treated a rifleman who had been hit in the hand, 3 fingers gone, bone visible, the man staring at the injury with a detached curiosity as if it belonged to someone else. Then came the scream, high-pitched, desperate, a sound that cut through the gunfire like a blade. It was coming from the no-man's land between the American line and the Japanese positions on the hillside. 75 yards of open ground churned to mud by artillery, studded with the stumps of blasted trees, completely exposed to enemy fire. A soldier was lying in the center of it, hit by a burst from a Nambu machine gun, unable to move, bleeding out in full view of both sides. No one moved to help him. The men in the foxholes looked away or stared with the blank expression of soldiers who had learned not to care because caring would drive them insane. The calculation was simple and brutal. 1 man was already lost. Trying to save him would cost 2 more, maybe 3. You didn't throw good lives after bad. You didn't compound one tragedy with another. This was the mathematics of war, and everyone understood it, and everyone hated understanding it. Frank Petrarca stood up. His company commander saw him and shouted. The exact words were lost in the noise, but the meaning was clear. Sit down. Stay alive. That's an order. Frank ignored him. He climbed out of the foxhole and started walking toward the wounded man. The Japanese saw him immediately. A medic, marked with a red cross, moving in the open. Some of them held fire. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected medical personnel, though the protection was honored more often in Europe than in the Pacific. Other Japanese soldiers had no such scruples, or perhaps they simply couldn't see the markings clearly, or perhaps they had been given orders to shoot anything that moved. The Nambu machine gun opened up. Frank dropped and crawled. The mud was thick enough to provide minimal cover. Bullets snapped overhead, clipping leaves, thudding into tree stumps. He moved in short bursts, 5 yards at a time, pausing behind whatever cover existed, then moving again. The wounded soldier was still screaming, a sound that was becoming weaker, thinner, running out of blood to sustain it. It took Frank 20 minutes to cover 75 yards. When he reached the wounded man, he didn't pause to assess the injuries. He rolled the soldier onto his back, jammed gauze into the bullet wounds, and then positioned himself as a shield between the man and the hillside. Machine gun rounds hit the ground around them. One passed through Frank's helmet, creasing the steel, missing his skull by an inch. He didn't move. He stayed flat, covering the wounded soldier with his own body, waiting for the stretcher-bearers to work up the courage to follow him. They came. 2 men, crawling through the same hell Frank had just crossed, dragging a canvas stretcher. Together they loaded the wounded soldier and pulled him back toward the American line. Frank came last, walking backward, keeping his body between the stretcher and the enemy. When they reached the foxholes, men who had watched the entire thing in silence pulled them down into cover. The wounded soldier lived. Frank received no commendation for the action because there was no time to write reports and because what he had done was both extraordinary and, in the context of Horseshoe Hill, relatively commonplace. Men did impossible things every hour. Most of them died in the process. Frank had succeeded, which made him lucky, not heroic. July 29th was worse. The Japanese launched a major assault on the American positions, throwing fresh troops into the battle in an attempt to break the stalemate. Artillery fire from both sides turned the jungle into a shredded wasteland. Trees were cut in half by high explosive shells. The ground was cratered like the surface of the moon. The air smelled of cordite and mud and the sweet rot stink of bodies that hadn't been recovered. A mortar barrage caught a squad in the open. Frank heard the impacts and ran toward them before the smoke cleared. 3 men down. One was already dead, his chest opened by shrapnel. No possibility of treatment. The second had a leg wound, survivable, screaming. The third was a sergeant Frank knew, a man named Morrison who had helped pull the buried sergeant free 2 days earlier. Morrison was buried again, this time under a collapsed section of trench. Dirt and sandbags and splintered wood covering everything but his head. Frank started digging. His hands were raw, fingernails torn, blood mixing with mud. He cleared Morrison's chest, then his arms, then worked down toward his legs. The sergeant was conscious, talking, asking if he was going to die. Frank lied and said no. He always lied. Telling a wounded man the truth served no purpose except to make his last moments more terrifying. Other soldiers joined the effort. They pulled Morrison free, loaded him onto a stretcher, and carried him back through the jungle toward the aid station. Frank treated the man with the leg wound, then moved on to the next casualty and the next. By afternoon, he had stopped counting. His medic bag was nearly empty. He was using strips torn from his own uniform as bandages. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, a deep cellular fatigue that made every movement feel like swimming through concrete. That night, he sat in his foxhole and ate cold rations. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was playing a harmonica, a sad, slow melody that reminded Frank of home. He thought about Cleveland, about his parents, about the house he had been building before the war, a small 2-bedroom for a young couple expecting their first child. He wondered if someone else had finished it. He wondered if he would ever build anything again, or if this jungle was where his life would end, his body rotting into the volcanic soil, forgotten except as a name on a casualty list. The thought didn't frighten him. Should have, but it didn't. He had moved past fear, past hope, past everything except the simple, mechanical act of survival. Wake up. Treat the wounded. Stay alive until tomorrow. Repeat. This was what combat did to men. It reduced existence to its most basic components and asked whether you could endure. Most could, for a time. Some broke. A few, like Frank, discovered they were capable of things they had never imagined. July 31st, 1943. His 25th birthday. The fighting resumed at dawn with an intensity that suggested both sides were reaching their breaking point. The Americans needed to take Horseshoe Hill to advance on Monday. The Japanese needed to hold it to protect the airfield. Neither side had reserves to commit. It would be decided by whichever force broke first. The attack began with an artillery barrage. American 105mm howitzers pounded the Japanese positions for 15 minutes, then lifted fire. The infantry went forward in a line, bayonets fixed, shouting to keep themselves moving through their fear. Frank followed with the second wave, watching men ahead of him fall, marking their locations mentally so he could return when the shooting stopped. The Japanese responded with everything they had. Machine guns fired from hidden bunkers. Mortars walked across the American line with methodical precision. Snipers picked off officers and radio men. The advance stalled 50 yards from the Japanese positions, the Americans pinned down in a depression that offered minimal cover and no concealment. A soldier was hit. 20 yards ahead, separated from the American line by open ground and a tangle of fallen trees. He wasn't screaming. That was worse. Men who screamed were often savable. Men who went quiet were dying. Frank watched him for 10 seconds, 15, 20. The soldier moved once, a weak attempt to crawl, then stopped. Frank made the decision in the same way he had made every other decision that week. He didn't think. He acted. He stood up, grabbed his medic bag, and ran. The Japanese saw him immediately. Rifle fire cracked from multiple positions. A burst from a machine gun chewed up the ground to his left. He dove behind a shattered tree stump, gasping, his heart hammering. The wounded soldier was 15 yards away, still not moving. Frank looked back at the American line. Men were yelling at him, waving him back, telling him it was too late, the soldier was dead, coming back was suicide. He could see their faces clearly, every expression of fear and helplessness and relief that it wasn't them out there. He looked forward at the wounded soldier. Still not moving. He ran. 5 yards. 10. The tree line above him erupted with muzzle flashes. Something hit him in the left leg, a massive impact that spun him sideways and dropped him to one knee. He pushed himself back up and kept running. Something else hit him in the abdomen, punching through the canvas of his medic bag, through his uniform, into the soft tissue beneath. He stumbled but didn't fall. He reached the wounded soldier and dropped beside him. The man was gone, eyes open, staring at nothing, blood pooling beneath him in the black mud. Dead. Frank had risked everything for a corpse. He started to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that turned into a cough. Blood came up, his own blood. He touched his abdomen and his hand came away red. The mortar round landed 3 feet away. Frank never heard it coming. The blast lifted him and threw him backward. Shrapnel tore through his legs, his chest, his arms. He landed on his back, staring up at the canopy. The green leaves and blue sky beyond. Everything very clear and bright and distant. He couldn't feel his legs. His chest felt compressed, as if a great weight was pressing down on him. He could taste blood in his mouth, thick and metallic. His vision was narrowing, darkness creeping in from the edges. He knew what this meant. He had seen it enough times. He was dying. Frank Joseph Petrarca, carpenter from Cleveland, combat medic of the 145th Infantry Regiment, 25 years old today, was dying in the mud of Horseshoe Hill, and there was nothing anyone could do to save him. Except he wasn't done. With an effort that cost him everything remaining, Frank pushed himself up onto his knees. Blood poured from his wounds. His intestines were visible through the torn fabric of his uniform. He should have been unconscious. He should have been dead. But he was kneeling in the mud, facing the Japanese positions on the hillside, and every man in both armies who could see him stopped shooting. And then he screamed. Not words, just sound. A roar of defiance and rage and grief for every man he had tried to save and failed. For every wounded soldier left to die because the mathematics of war said rescue was impossible. For every moment of fear and pain and exhaustion that had brought him to this place. He screamed at the jungle and the war and death itself, and for 3 seconds the entire battlefield fell silent. Then he collapsed forward into the mud and died. The Americans recovered his body that night, after the Japanese withdrew from Horseshoe Hill under cover of darkness. They carried Frank Petrarca back through the jungle on a stretcher, the same canvas stretcher he had used to carry so many others. His medic bag was still strapped to his body, empty of supplies, soaked with blood. The Medal of Honor citation would later read that Private First Class Frank Joseph Petrarca had distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. It would describe his actions on July 27th, July 29th, and July 31st with the dry precision of official military language. It would note that he had saved numerous lives through his courage and self-sacrifice. It would not mention the scream. Official citations rarely captured such moments. But the men who had been there remembered. They remembered the carpenter from Cleveland who became a medic without medical training and learned his profession in the worst classroom imaginable. They remembered him crawling through machine gun fire, shielding wounded men with his body, pulling them from collapsed trenches, staying calm when everything around him was chaos. They remembered his 25th birthday, though they hadn't known it was his birthday at the time. They remembered watching him die and knowing they were witnessing something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Frank Petrarca's death changed American combat medicine. After the New Georgia campaign, the Army began a systematic review of medic casualties and combat effectiveness. The data was clear. Medics operating alone in forward positions suffered catastrophic casualty rates, while their impact on survival rates was limited by their inability to evacuate wounded men under fire. The solution was to create aid teams, pairs of medics who could cover each other, and to establish clear protocols for when rescue was tactically feasible and when it was not. The changes came too late for Frank, but they saved thousands of lives in subsequent campaigns. Medics in Italy, France, and Germany operated under new doctrines that acknowledged the truth Frank had learned on Horseshoe Hill. Courage without support was suicide. One medic couldn't save a company, but a well-coordinated medical system could save an army. Frank Joseph Petrarca is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His Medal of Honor is displayed in a museum in Cleveland. His name appears on memorials to the 37th Infantry Division and the New Georgia campaign. These are the official records of his existence, the paper trail that proves he lived and fought and died. But the real memorial is the men who survived because of him. The soldier he crawled 75 yards to reach on July 27th went home to his wife and had 3 children. The sergeant buried by the mortar barrage on July 29th recovered from his injuries and lived to be 82 years old. Even the man Frank died trying to reach, though dead before Frank arrived, had a brother in another company who learned what Frank had tried to do and carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. War is a machine that consumes men and produces grief. It is efficient, thorough, and indifferent. But within that machine are moments when individuals choose to be more than efficient, more than thorough, more than indifferent. They choose, against all logic and survival instinct, to believe that one life matters enough to risk everything. Frank Petrarca made that choice 3 times in 5 days. The first time he succeeded. The second time he succeeded. The third time he died. But even in dying, he succeeded in proving something the war tried daily to disprove. That courage exists. That compassion exists. That men can face hell and choose, in their final moments, to rage against it rather than surrender to it. The scream on Horseshoe Hill was not a scream of pain. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of absolute refusal. A rejection of the idea that death gets the final word. A declaration that even a carpenter from Cleveland, scared and wounded and dying in the mud, could face the void and tell it no. That scream echoed across Horseshoe Hill on July 31st, 1943. In some ways, it's still echoing. Every medic who runs toward gunfire instead of away from it. Every soldier who stands when every instinct says to stay down. Every person who chooses to act when an action would be safer, easier, more rational. They're answering that scream. They're continuing the conversation Frank Petrarca started with his last breath. He was not supposed to be a hero. He was supposed to be building houses. But the Depression took that future, and the war took his life, and what remains is a story about an ordinary man who did extraordinary things because the men around him were dying and someone had to try to save them. That's the truth of Horseshoe Hill. Not that heroes exist, but that ordinary men become heroes when circumstances demand it and they refuse to look away. Frank Petrarca looked at wounded men in kill zones and couldn't accept leaving them there. He looked at the mathematics of war, the cold calculation that said one life wasn't worth 2, and he disagreed. He paid for that disagreement with his life. But in paying it, he proved the calculation was wrong. One life was worth everything. His actions said so. His death confirmed it. And the men who lived because of him carried that knowledge forward into a world that desperately needed to remember it. If the story has moved you, if Frank Petrarca's sacrifice means something to you, I ask that you subscribe to this channel and like this video. Not for the algorithm, though that helps, but because stories like this deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be told and retold until the lessons they contain become part of our collective understanding of what humans are capable of when pushed to their limits. I also want to know what you think. After hearing Frank's story, what stands out to you most? Is it his courage? His compassion? The senselessness of his death, or the meaning it created? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what Frank Petrarca's story means to you. Because that conversation, that ongoing dialogue about sacrifice and duty and the value of human life, is the real memorial. That's how we keep men like Frank alive long after their bodies have turned to dust. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for ensuring that a carpenter from Cleveland who became a medic and died at 25 in a jungle half a world away from home is not forgotten.